Hi, everyone. I'm Rick Cox, and this is another clinically pressed leadership insight. Today, I want to do something a little bit different than I've done in the past, the last few. I want to talk about something that is important to me that I've been practicing recently, and that's this idea of Stoicism. So I want to talk a little bit about it. I want to give you an intro to it, and I want to discuss how Stoicism can be applied to leadership. So, what is Stoicism? Stoicism is a school of ancient philosophy that was begun in the 4th century BC by a man named Zeno, and I'll get into his story in a little bit. But before I get really into it, I want to discuss an important distinction, and that is this idea of uppercase stoicism and lowercase stoicism. So when we think of the word stoic and we think of someone who is what we would refer to as stoic, oftentimes we think of them as potentially unfeeling, lacking emotion, and maybe being cold hearted. But when you really learn about this philosophy of Stoicism, those that practice it, those Stoics, are often anything but unfeeling. So, why do we call it Stoicism if it's not at all related to what we know as this word Stoic? Well, it comes from the root word stoa poikol, which translates to painted porch. And this is where the founder of Stoicism and his disciples would often gather to have these philosophical discussions around the principles contained within Stoicism. And actually, the ruins are apparently still there, and you can go and you can actually look at the original Stoa Poikil, the painted porch, where Zeno and his students and his disciples would come together and have these philosophical discussions. So, who is Zeno? Zeno is the founder of Stoicism. He lived from 334 BC to 262 BC, and he was a member of a wealthy family, and he was a merchant that sold purple dye, and purple was an important color back in ancient Rome, ancient Athens, because only royals wore purple, and the reason is the dye was made from blood extracted from sea snails, and this was a very painstaking process, often done by slaves. And since the process was so challenging and it was challenging to procure it, it made it very expensive and often could only be afforded by royals. So that's why, centuries ago, only royals wore purple because they were the only ones that could afford the dye. And so Zeno, he was carrying a ship full of this purple dye, and he was shipwrecked off the coast of Athens, losing all of the dye that he was transported. He ended up at a bookshop where the bookseller was actually reading Socrates, and which transformed Zeno, and it made him realize that he wanted to become a philosopher. So he asked the bookseller, "Where can I find a man like that?" He was looking for his own Socrates, an actual living person to learn from. And just so happens, as the tale goes, that Crates of Thebes was walking by. Crates was a well-known philosopher in Athens at the time, and Zeno, he went and he basically followed him around, and he learned his philosophical ideas, and he studied him, and he basically used that schooling to create Stoicism, which was his own philosophical school. So now that we know how it started, what is it, right? What are the principles? And the four main virtues of Stoicism are courage, justice, wisdom, and temperance, which is also known as moderation. And these are things that a practicing Stoic works into their daily lives in all aspects of their lives. And these are just things that I think as human beings we should definitely be working to practice all over. Courage, justice, wisdom, and moderation. These things are things that will improve our lives tremendously. So those are the virtues. I want to give you three Stoic philosophical ideas. The first one being Memento Mori, which is a Latin phrase meaning "remember you must die." And this it sounds pretty morbid, but really, when you look at it, it just makes you realize how little time you have on Earth, right? And the sort of the phrase that's often associated with Memento Mori is, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." And it's basically just recognizing that death is inevitable, and you should use the time you have on earth to the absolute fullest. So Stoics will often view each day not as a day lived, but as a day that we have died, which again sounds morbid, but it's really a way to sort of reframe how you look at life and allow us to really view life as precious, view life as finite, and use the limited amount we have to do good, to help others, to be of service, and really just live life the best we can, and not take it for granted. I think that's the biggest takeaway from it, is you don't take it for granted, because it's obviously it's not infinite. We know this. The second philosophical idea associated with Stoicism is this idea of amor fati, or a love of fate. And the way I like to look at this is look at challenges as opportunities. So, so something happened that was out of our control, and we would say, how can I use this to my advantage? What can I learn? How can I improve because of it? So when something terrible happens to you, you have a couple of options, right? You can complain, you can sulk, you can feel bad for yourself, or you can say, "Hey, this happened to me, and I'm going to learn from it. I'm going to make myself better, and I'm going to know for if this thing happens the next time, I know that I can overcome, and I can be good." And so this other, going along with this, is this idea that you can't control what happens, you can only control how you respond, which is something that I've even before I really studied Stoicism, I think I kind of intuitively practiced this and recognized this in my own life. And it comes down to, you don't basically, that's exactly what it is. Things happen that are outside of your control. You can't help that. But how you respond is the most important thing, and that's all that you really have control over. And I really like this idea of others cannot make you upset, they can't make you annoyed, etc. You allow yourself to feel that way. Now, they may have done something, they may have done something that would make you annoyed, would make you upset, but they can't force you to feel a certain way. And that doesn't mean that you can't get upset or annoyed. I get upset and I get annoyed just like anybody. But really, when you recognize that you are allowing yourself to feel this way, you can oftentimes override that emotion, and you kind of go back to it as, okay, this person made me feel this negative emotion. What have I learned? How can I improve? And how can I take advantage of that particular situation? The next would be Premeditatio Malorum, or what's often called the premeditation of evils. And this is where you picture things going wrong, you picture these terrible things that happen, and then it sounds terrible, it sounds morbid again, just like a Memento Mori, but really what it comes down to is things that happen usually aren't as bad as the way that we imagine them. And what it does is it helps us prepare for inevitable setbacks, because obviously no life is perfect. Things are going to happen to us that we wish didn't happen. But if we have imagined these things happening, and we've made ourselves aware that these things can happen, we're more prepared. And we steel ourselves and we make ourselves a little bit more resilient. So when these eventualities occur, we can really rise up and overcome them, because we've pictured them, we recognize that they could happen, and we've oftentimes thought out what if this did happen to me, how would I respond? And I think this is oftentimes where it applies to athletic training, because we have our emergency action plans. We practice our emergency action plans. Oftentimes, I've seen on social media athletic trainers talking about using the certain times in the game, usually the national anthem or something, to go over the EAPs in their mind, picture a terrible injury or something happening, and how exactly they're going to respond when that injury occurs. So I really like that, how premeditation malorum can directly relate to athletic training. And so when you look at Stoicism, the people who studied it, there's really who are sometimes referred to as the big three, and those would be Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus Aurelius is probably the most well known of the Stoics. He was the emperor of Rome. If you've seen the movie Gladiator, he was a pretty prominent character in the beginning of that, and he's someone that's very, very often quoted. His personal journal was published, and it's called Meditations, and it's widely read all over the world. There's countless translations. There's lots of people that have used meditations to improve their lives, and he was writing to himself on a daily basis, and what's really interesting is Marcus Aurelius lived during the Antonine Plague, which was, it was a pandemic, just like we've been going through for the past year plus, and he was writing these things, and for him, the Antonine Plague lasted for 15 years. So it's one of these things. If we can look at him and see how he lived, and how he made the best of it when he was going through a 15-year plague, we could maybe use some of these ideas to help ourselves get through our current pandemic. But it's not just practiced by people who were lived centuries ago. There are contemporary athletes, CEOs, film stars, military leaders that have all embraced Stoicism to really help themselves improve their lives, be better at their jobs, and leave a really big impact on the world. So where would you start if you wanted to learn more about Stoicism? A lot of people say go right to the source material, read Meditations, read discourses by Epictetus, read Letters from a Stoic by Seneca. And while I think these are all great, and I have all of these sources and I read them regularly, they can be really challenging to actually read and get through. They're translated. They had a kind of a different way of speaking, and they can be really challenging to consume, especially on the first try. And they're definitely not made for a single kind of cover to cover read. It's definitely something you have to go back and you have to read it multiple times. You have to think about it. You have to write about it. You have to take these notes and recognize, hey, these principles are really important. They can help me. So instead of necessarily going straight to the source material, if you're brand new to it, I would recommend The Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday. He's a guy who's really he's made Stoicism, brought it into the mainstream, and he has he has books, he has podcasts, he has a YouTube channel where he breaks down a lot of these Stoic principles, and he makes it accessible for those of us today. And I think that's just probably the best place to start. Is go to Daily Stoic on YouTube, download the podcast. They're generally it's daily, just like Daily Stoic. So, and they're generally 3 to 4 minutes long, and he just has these contemporary discussions about these philosophical ideas. Where it applies to leadership, I think the 4 virtues are things that any leader should work to incorporate into their leadership style and philosophy. Anyone that chooses to practice courage, wisdom, justice, and temperance, you're going to be a better leader if you actively choose to incorporate these principles into your daily life. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Leadership Insights. Let me know what you think about this topic. It's something that's near and dear to me. It's something that I that I'm learning about on a regular basis. It's something I read about all the time, and I'm definitely interested in making it a series and potentially expanding on some of these different ideas and virtues in the area of Stoicism. So I hope you enjoyed it, and uh, I'm definitely interested in doing more. So thank you for listening, and as always, keep developing that leadership ability.